In 2017, the Pew Research Center did their largest ever study on politics in the United States. Interviewed over 10,000 people. And the purpose of their research at that point was to investigate the polarization that was happening in our culture and in our society. And as part of their research, they asked some questions that allowed them to see how each member of each party saw members of the other party. And one of the questions was to elicit how many people had very unfavorable views of the other party. Now, when they did their research, they make it pretty clear that the majority of Republicans and Democrats, and yes, independents and libertarians, we see you, but we're focusing on those two primary groups as illustrative models. What they found out is that the majority of them, over time, have typically viewed people in the other party unfavorably, right? Unfavorably. But what they wanted to get at was this very unfavorable experience. And this is what they discovered. In 1994, 17% of Republicans and 16% of Democrats had very unfavorable views of the other party. And that's the highest level of unfavorability, okay? By 2017, look where those numbers had gone. 45% and 44%, very unfavorable. Okay, that's 2017. It's 2020. My guess is those numbers have likely gone up. And the polarization that we're seeing in our populace is also impacting our elected representatives, at least some of them. Another major research study was done in 2015 by a different group, and I'm going to zoom in here and let you see I just wanted to give you the overall picture, and I'll zoom in here so that you can see it a little bit closer. What they did was they went and looked at votes that were taken in the United States House of Representatives from 1949 to 2012. Each of those dots that you see on the screen represent a voting member of the United States House of Representatives. Blue dots represent Democrats, red dots represent Republicans. And what they were looking at was how often individual members of each party crossed over. They were looking for signs of compromise and the willingness to work together. So on the top left-hand side of that screen for you, you're going to see kind of a cloud of red and blue. Yes, there are more red on your left, more red on your right, more blue on your left, but you see some work in the middle. And you see how that varies throughout those middle years. That on the bottom right is 1987 at that point. But let's come to the years that lead up to today, or to 2012, right? Just further and further apart. Fewer and fewer politicians willing to cross over and willing to work together. Again, that last bit, those last little blobs that you're seeing on the bottom right, that's 2012. Makes you wonder what it would look like today. My guess is it certainly wouldn't be any better, right? While this is kind of an examination of where we are politically, it's illustrative of where we also are in other issues. And we've been talking about that. The divides that we're facing theologically and ideologically, we've seen some improvement, we've seen some good things, but you don't have to look very far before you see examples of our differences causing greater and greater division. We're divided based on our religion. We're divided based on our politics. We're divided based on our ideologies. There are divisions when it comes to race. There are divisions when it comes to income and education, when it comes to sexual orientation. We are divided north and south. We're divided urban and rural. We're divided coastal states and plains states. I was reminded this morning after worship, we're divided by generations regarding age and view of the world and how we live and work and study and have families. There is example after example of divisions that we are facing in our society, in our culture, and as many of you may have experienced in our own families. That's why we're starting 2020 with this series. A series that is designed for us to take some time and intentionally explore these divisions, why they exist, how we can combat them, how we as individual Christians and as a church can step into the divide. If we're going to be a movement for wholeness in a fragmented world, which is our vision, if that's who we're going to be as a church, we got to get in the mix of this so that we can start to bring some healing and some hope. So to this point in our journey, we focused on the foundations. We've looked at the scriptural reasons and the theological reasons and the call of Christ for individuals and for churches to work together to make sure that we're doing this. We've been talking about foundation work, justification for us to be doing this work and why it's so important. Today, we're going to spend several weeks, we're going to start looking at steps, practical steps, action steps that each one of us can take and that the church can take as a whole to help us start to bridge the divides and bring some reconciliation into the midst of this division. And as I was preparing for today, I was all over the place in terms of what a first step is and maybe what a most important first step is. And I don't know that we should rank them in that way. But what became clear to me is that there is what I think to be an obvious first step that needs to be taken in terms of our crossing the divides that are separating us today. And that first step is to build relationships. We've got to be in relationships with people who are not like us. Relationships matter. And when we have relationships, we're able to see people in new and humanizing ways that we may not have been able to do before or without those relationships. We've talked about Jesus and the church that he was born into. The church into which Jesus was born was a church that was a very tight-knit, closed-circle group of people. Your relationships were with people who looked like you, who lived like you, who believed like you, who worshiped like you, and they wanted to keep it that way. In fact, they discouraged relationships with people who were outside that religious community. They didn't want that to happen. They saw it as something that could be defiling and leave you unclean and separated from God. Your righteousness was based on remaining pure, and that includes your relationships. Well, when Jesus came into the world, Jesus wasn't having any part of that. Jesus understood that they were getting it wrong, and he wanted to show them a new way of living. And so what Jesus did was he not only had relationships with people in his own tight-knit community, he began to have relationships with people outside of that community, with people of other nationalities and races and religions, with people of different understandings of the way the world works, with outsiders and outcasts, with the sick, with the impoverished, with those who were oppressed, with the vulnerable and with the powerful. Jesus was willing to be engaged in relationship with anyone who was willing to enter into that with him, and he did so over and over and over again. Part of the reason he did so was to help the church understand that God created diversity in the world and in the church by design. The diversity was not a weakness. It was not something that caused us to be away from God and further apart from God. It wasn't something that caused us to be defiled and unclean and impure and unrighteous. In fact, Jesus demonstrated that living into that diversity was to see God in God's fullness and to understand that our greatest strength is when we come together as one, not in spite of our differences, but bringing those differences with us so that we can see the fullness of how God created us and humankind and the world around us. And so we as Christians are called to follow the model of Jesus and to be in relationship with people who are different than we are, those we might see as outside or other. My experience is that relationship matters and relationship changes things, and relationship helps us to bridge these divides that we face. And I want to give you an example of that just by sharing with you the story of our own church and how we've experienced this. Several years ago, we as a church decided that we were going to bridge the divide between Christian and Muslim, that we were going to reach out to our Muslim neighbors and seek to understand them more, to learn about them, to be in relationship with them. And that journey began rather simply. I went and spent some time with the imam over at the mosque on River Road. This is Wasif Iqbal. And I have a confession to make. I had never really spent much time with a person of the Muslim faith to this point. I had never sat down and had conversation with an imam. It was without question, the longest conversation I'd ever had with a faith leader from the Muslim community. And one of the stories that I want to tell you in that is an example of why it was important for me to form relationship. When this picture was taken, before the picture was taken, he made a joke with me. The guy who was taking the picture had my phone, just iPhone. But the case on it was a Dallas Cowboy case. And so, my new one doesn't have that. My new one doesn't have that because I'm a little soured on them right now. So he said, I can't smile. And I said, well, Wasif, why can't you smile? He said, I can't smile at that star. I said, what do you mean you can't smile at that star? He goes, I can't smile at anything, Dallas Cowboys. I'm a Baltimore Ravens fan. And I mean, for the life of me, I'm trying to figure out how this dude could possibly be a Baltimore Ravens fan. I mean, on a lot of levels, right? On a lot of levels. And I think before I could even catch myself, I just said, how on earth are you a Baltimore Ravens fan? And he said, well, I was born and raised in Baltimore. He stopped me cold with those words. Because the implicit bias that I carried into that conversation was that this dark-skinned Middle Eastern man in traditional Muslim attire was an immigrant to our country, that he'd come from somewhere else, that he was different and an outsider. I was born in Texas. I was raised in Oklahoma. That's why I'm a Dallas Cowboy fan. He was born in Baltimore. He was raised in Baltimore. That's the only justifiable reason to be a Baltimore Ravens fan. Right? I know. He's as much an American as I am. And I know better than that. Doggone it, I know better than that. I've got a child of color, and I can't stand it when people make assumptions about him when they don't know him. I know better than that, and in that moment, I committed the same sin. Why? Because I didn't have a relationship. Friends, relationship matters. So in our journey, in our conversations, Wasif invited us as a church to come and join them for prayer. They do Friday prayer, and they invite people from the outside the Muslim community to just come and observe. And so we went. We set up a schedule to go and worship with them. Just a couple days before we were supposed to be there, their mosque was vandalized. Horribly. I'm showing you what is appropriate for all ages on a Sunday morning, and I feel like this one is even stretching that. This is terrifying, scary stuff. And I'm not going to lie to you, as I woke up on that Friday morning and went to prayer, I was a little nervous. But we went and we prayed and we watched with them and we observed and we held vigil with them. And then after that experience, we worked with several hundred other Louisvillians to clean up their property and restore their property and to establish a peace bench there and just to work together and to be community. After we started this relationship with River Road, we reached out to the Turkish Muslim community here in Louisville, and the first thing we did with them was we served those in need. Here's a group of church members who are working alongside some Turkish Muslim women, and there were others there who just aren't in this picture, and we were at an emergency shelter. And we did this a couple times with them. We just set aside our differences. We want to make the world a better place, and so we just went and served those who were in need and most vulnerable. This was a family emergency shelter that we worked at together. Out of that experience, they invited us to come and join them for an Iftar. An Iftar is something that takes place during the month of Ramadan, where Muslims invite people outside of their community to come and learn about their faith, to form relationships, to observe prayer, and to eat an absolutely delicious meal, to break bread, to break the fast together with them. And we've now done that multiple times. After forming those relationships and going to their place, we invited them to come to our place. And we had a panel of several Muslim women who came and just spoke to us. Muslim women building bridges is what they call themselves. And they just answered questions about what it's like to be a woman in the Muslim faith. And they broke down all kinds of stereotypes and answered hard questions and engaged with us. And while we were up here doing that work in the sanctuary, our teens and their teens were down in our youth center doing the work of getting to know each other beyond racial and ethnic and religious lines, discovering that together they could all eat more potato chips than anyone could ever imagine a single person or group of people being able to eat. And they had a good time. I love this picture, the joy that is in that picture. You can't stage that. There's so many stories I could tell you that came out of this, but I want to tell you the story of one person in our congregation who really experienced, and there were multiple, but I want to tell you a story about this picture because this is one of my favorite pictures in the life of this journey in the life of our church. On your right is Putty Scott. Putty is a member of our church. She's one of our elders. And on your left is Fawzia Osmond, who is a member of the local Muslim community here in Louisville. I was reminded of this picture as I was preparing this week, and I called Putty and asked her if I could get the backstory behind it. I wanted to hear her experience of this. So the first thing that she told me was that going over to the prayer center and being there for worship that night, and this was the first time that she had ever been in relationship of any kind with people of the Muslim faith. She'd never sat down and spent time in conversation, getting to know them. This was a big first for her. And the first thing that she wanted to talk about was just her overall impression of that faith. As we sat in the room and they explained their faith and talked about Ramadan and what it means to them, her first response was, man, these people are dedicated, right? And think about this for a moment. In Christianity, what we're seeing right now is a decline in attendance and practices of faith. But we go over there and we sit down and they start talking about what they're doing. First of all, for 30 days in Ramadan, they don't eat from sunup to sundown. And some people don't even drink. They don't drink any water or anything from sunup to sundown. They pray 5 times a day. They show up and they go. It is not an option for them. They are absolutely there. And as they're explaining that and as they're talking about that, even though she believes fundamentally very differently about who God is and how God works in the world, and though she's a dedicated follower of Jesus Christ, she was inspired by the level of their faith. And she learned something about their commitment to their faith. She didn't know that before. And it stretched her and kind of drew her in a really powerful way. So then she starts to talk to Fawzia. She just sat down with her. It's kind of a random thing. And they start talking. And what she learns is that Fawzia is leaving that week to go to Baghdad. Why? Because she works for the United States government. And she works on a military base in Baghdad. And as they talked about that, Fawzia talked about one of the things that she likes about that work is that she gets to know and be in relationship with the soldiers, with the men and women of the American Armed Forces who are over there serving our country. And she says, there they are. They're away from their families. They're in a war zone. They're at risk. They're living every day in danger. They're away from their parents. And, she said that she's found herself almost like a surrogate mom for them. Caring for them and loving on them and hearing their stories and just kind of being there and checking in with them. She said, I have just come to love these kids like they're my own children. And as Putty was listening to her talk, she thought, if my kids were over there, it'd make me feel a lot better knowing that someone like Fawzia was caring for them and loving them and making sure that they were okay and that they're eating and they're sleeping and so pretty soon, as they continue to share stories, all of those differences, the racial differences, the ethnic differences, the religious differences, the differences of stories of past, all that stuff just kind of faded away, leaving 2 moms talking about caring for kids because you love them. And that's what you would want someone to do for your kid. Right? So in that moment, Putty crossed the divide. And maybe Fawzia did too. They spent time in relationship with someone who was different. They found the humanity in that person. They came to see them in a completely different way. After that evening was over, Putty stayed in contact and got updates on Fawzia by reaching out to her daughter and hearing how she was doing. And Putty continues to hold Fawzia in prayer. That's the power of relationship. And Putty, by her own confession, just talks about the difference it made in her life and how powerful it was for her to experience that. I know it sounds simplistic, but relationships matter. When we get to know people, it matters because we get to see them as the humans that they are. We get to discover that though there may be all kinds of things that make us different from one another, and while we may disagree with them passionately and fundamentally, more often than not, we have more in common than we do in difference. But being in relationship with people who are different from us doesn't mean that we have to set aside the things that are core to who we are and what we believe. We get to take all of those things with us. It's not about that. It's not about letting go of those things that are most important to us. It's about making sure that we also keep in mind that while these are the most important things to us, it doesn't make someone less of a human because they're in a different place. I want to invite you to do some work this morning. And I want you to be honest. This is just between you and God. I want to ask you a little bit about your circles, about who you're in relationship with. Now, we all define circles in a different way and how we're in relationship with other people differently. But I want you to think beyond casual acquaintance. I want you to think beyond someone that you just work with or go to school with. I want you to think about people who are actually, that you have relationship with. That you may actually know the names of other family members or pets. That you've heard some stories. That's the kind of relationship that I'm talking about. Not just acquaintance. And I just want you to hold in mind how many people you have in your circle as I offer some examples. How many people are in your circle who are part of a different faith than you? Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, no faith, atheist? How many people do you have in your circle who are of a different race or ethnicity? Have a skin color very different than you do, a nationality different than you do? How many people are in your circle who you would call friends that are of a differing political party? In the Pew Research study that I mentioned moments ago, they found that the majority of Republicans and Democrats said they have somewhere between few and no close friends from the other party. How many people in your circle are members of the LGBTQ plus community? And you know their story. And you know about their lives. Do you know anyone who is on the temporary, the TANF program, the temporary need for aid for families, what we often call welfare? Do you know anybody that's on the supplemental nutrition program that we often call that's called SNAP? It's what we would call food stamps. Do you know anyone who is in either of those programs? Are you friends with someone that hasn't graduated high school? Do you know any farmers? Friends, who's in your circle? Who are you spending time with? And look, I don't want to suggest that it's not okay to spend time with people who look like us and believe like us and think like us, but when we take an honest assessment as to where we are and who is in our circle and who we really know, for most of us, I think it's a fair statement to say we could probably do a little bit better. And that maybe, just maybe, part of the reason we're so divided is that we're divided. That we don't have those kinds of relationships. I want to encourage you not just to think about where you are, but is there an opportunity in a moment for you to reach out, to have coffee with someone, to go and talk with someone, to figure out their story, to sit and listen to them and just be in relationship with them. I want to encourage you to follow the example of Jesus. You know, when I think about that picture of Putty with Fawzia, and I see Jesus in that picture. You know, this is what I imagine it looking like as Jesus was talking to Zacchaeus. You know, the same kind of love and embrace and support when Jesus was talking to the Samaritan woman at the well whose village had just shunned her and pushed her out. When Jesus was talking with the centurion. When Jesus met with the Pharisees. When Jesus was encouraging his disciples. And when Jesus was healing the lepers and that leper came back and thanked him. Can you see Jesus in that picture? That's who Jesus calls us to be. Imagine what the world would look like if there were more pictures like that. that we could share. I want to close this morning by sharing with you a resource. Over the course of the next few weeks, I'm going to give you a resource each week. Something that you can go and do outside of this space of worship. And they might not all land on you. It might not be something you want to investigate, but I want to give you some resources that have helped me as I've been preparing for this journey and preparing for this series. And the first resource that I want to share with you is this one. It's a book called I Think You're Wrong, But I'm Listening. It's written by two women with deep Kentucky roots. Sarah Stewart Holland and Beth Silvers. Sarah lives in Paducah, and Beth worships at the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in Florence, Kentucky. They both graduated Transylvania University, a fine Disciples of Christ institution over there where there's another school in Kentucky. It's in Lexington, by the way. Here's what Sarah and Beth are doing. Sarah is a Democrat. She's a progressive Democrat. Beth is a conservative Republican. And they're just practicing dialogue. They're not debating. They're not arguing. They're just sitting down. They're just sharing stories, and they're just talking with one another. They got a podcast called Pantsuit Politics. And over the course of several years, they've been practicing crossing the divide and forming a relationship with one another and with others. This book is inspiring. It is indicting. It is instructional and challenging. The podcast is the same. This was just published. They're really doing really, really good work, and I can't recommend it highly enough. Yes, it's about politics, right? It is. But it gives us some practices that go well beyond the nature of politics. I put links to the book and to the podcast on today's sermon page. Just to be clear, I get no kickback from any of this. But I want to give you some things that if you're interested, you can engage in and look at. And these are some really, really good resources. And it gives great example for how to be in relationship with others. Next week, we're going to talk about truth. Why it matters. Why it's important. Why there are times that it doesn't matter. And I'll have to walk you through that. But in some ways, that may be the most important part of our conversation next week. The journey that we're on is challenging. It's risky, it's vulnerable, and it's going to take some work from all of us. But I'm convinced that together we're going to find ourselves in a better place. So may we continue to cross the divide, to do so faithfully, prayerfully, humbly, and with grace. For in so doing, I think we'll find the way of Jesus is better than the way we often choose. Amen.